Another week and we are back with another useful quick tip from dataplatformcentral.com. In this week we have chosen a Power Query related quick tip, and the quick tip is on the concept of subtables and how we can implement aggregated filters using subtables inside your Power Query sheets. So the impetus for this video came from a recent discussion I had with one of my colleagues. He just asked me like how you can implement an aggregated filter. So I told him that using the concept of subtables, it's very easy to implement these aggregated filters inside your Power Query sheet. And he was asking like, what do you mean by subtables? So that's when I realized like not too many people knew the concept of subtables inside Power Query. So I thought I would make it into a video so that it can be beneficial to all of you people who are following this video. So let's look at how we can implement the concept of subtables inside your Power Query sheet and use it for scenarios which requires some kind of an aggregated related filter. So let's go straight into a couple of scenarios which speaks about this concept. So let's look at the first scenario. The first scenario is like I have data coming from a file which consists of multiple instances of the same customer. I need to get the latest entry corresponding to each customer based on the entry date. So we have a sheet with some customer data and we have multiple entries per customer, and we need to pick up the one entry from the customer which is latest. So if you see this typical scenario, if you compare this to a SQL, suppose this data is coming from an RDBMS source, then we could have easily used a simple derived table based SQL for getting this result. So the SQL will look like something like this. So you will implement a row number over a partitioning by that customer name, because customer name has multiples here, and then you will apply that filter on top of that row number generated to get the latest entry. So if you see that the row number over partition by customer name, order by modified date, descending. So this will actually group it into small groups within the table based on customer name, and then it will just number it based on the modified date, descending order. And so the latest one will get 1, and when you filter on one, you will get the latest entry for each customer. This is how it used to work in SQL. Now, if you want to implement the same logic inside Power Query, for example, you are working with a file, in which case you can't use SQL as a source statement. So then, for getting the corresponding functionality, you need to use the concept of subtables. Similarly, let's look at another scenario. So from a player selection history data, players who have never been rejected needs to be identified from the current list, which means that there are multiple entries per player for each year, and you have to pick only those players who have never been rejected. That means none of his entries have the status as rejected. So if you again compare this to a SQL related scenario, you could simply write an SQL statement like this, which will group by player name and put a filter based on the having condition on the aggregated data. So you apply a count and you will check for the number of occurrences of rejected, and you will filter for those players who doesn't have any occurrences of rejected entries, and then you use it to join to your main table to get those entries for the players who have never been rejected. Now again, if you compare it and try to implement this particular scenario inside your Power Query, you have to make use of a subtable. So let's look at how these two scenarios can be implemented inside your Power Query sheet by using this subtable concept. So I have opened a Power BI sheet with both the data sources set up here. So you can see the customer contact and the player selection. These two represents the same data that we have seen in those two scenarios beforehand. So let's first go to the customer contact and see what is the data inside it. Let's go to the edit query to go inside the Power Query window. So you will see the Power Query window being loaded with the data. So if you see the data, you can see that there are multiple rows per customer existing, and you see that the dates are different dates. So what we need here is the latest entry per customer. So let's see how we can do it by using this concept of subtables. So to get the subtable, of course we have to do some kind of an aggregation. So that's our first hint, because we have to do an aggregation. How can you do an aggregation? By applying group by. So on what basis we need to group by? Depending on the column which is repeating. So here if you see, it's based on customer, so same customer entry is getting repeated. So that is the column based on which we want to apply group by. So what you can do is, first step should be to select the column name, and then there is a nice little option called group by option. You can access it from the home tab itself. So click on group by and you will get various options for performing your aggregation. So if you see the operation, you can do count rows, count district rows, etc. Now here we are going to create a subtable. So for that we need to choose the option as all rows. So what it does is that it will group the data based on this column that we have selected, and it will create sub tables under each group, and which will have all the entries corresponding to that group. So now what we can name them is like, we can just name it like customer entries, because that's what they contain basically. So if you, and we are grouping by customer name, and when you click on OK, what will happen is that the result set will get reduced to two columns. One will contain the customer name, that is the column based on which we applied the group by, and second one will contain the sub tables corresponding to each of those customer groups. So if you go to the first customer, which is customer 2, and click on the table, you can see all the entries for the customer 2 inside that. So it will create some kind of a sub table for each of those customer name. We don't have to expand that, so I'll be just removing that step. So we will bond it as table itself. So now what we have managed to do is like, we have managed to bring them into a sub table for each of those customers. Now inside this sub table, we have to apply our logic. This is analogous to the group by or the derived table logic that we put in SQL Server for generating the sequence. So here we need to generate a sequence number first, and then based on the sequence number, when you filter, you will get the latest entry for each customer. Now for applying that, you have a option called add column. Inside that you have something known as custom column. So you can make use of this custom column for applying this sequence logic. So click on the custom column, and it will open a custom column formula bar. So here first you need to do is, first you need to sort it, because we want to get it based on the latest entry. So in order to get that, we need to first sort it. So you have something known as Table.sort. This function is available inside mcode. And now if you see the parameters, the first name will be a table, second will be the comparison criteria. So what is the table here? The table name is called cust entries. That is the table that is created as a part of the group by. So we will pass that as the first argument. Second argument will be our comparison criteria. Here we want to order it based on modified date. So what you can do is like, you need to pass it as a list. So you need to pass it as a list. You need to pass it like modified date and order descending, because we want to sort it based on the descending order of modified date, so as to get the latest entry first. So once you do the sort, automatically the table will get sorted with the latest entry coming first, and it will go backwards for each of the customers. Now on top of this, we need to apply the logic to apply the sequence number. So there is a function called add index column. It can be used for applying the index column inside. So add index column, and the first argument will be the sorted table, and the second argument will be the name of the column. So we will just name it like entry ID. You can give any name. I am just giving it entry ID. And then what is the initial value? So we will always start with 1. So the number will go like 1, 2, 3, etc. So now that we have added both the conditions, first one was to sort the table in the descending order of modified date, so as to get the latest entry, and on top of that we have applied this add index column so as to generate the index number based on this order. Now click on OK. It will result in another table, and that table will be the sorted table based on modified date, descending order, and then it will add the identity column or the sequence column here, or what they call it as index column, based on this descending order. So now we don't need the main table anymore, so we can remove it. Now if you just go inside any one of these tables, for example if I go inside table customer 2 table, now if you see that the table is sorted in the descending order. See, the first one will be the latest date, and it will go all the way backwards based on the descending order. And if you see the index ID that is generated, the first one will have 1, 2, 3, etc. Now if you just filter on this one, we will get the latest entry. We need to repeat it for every customer. So I just expanded the table, so I am again going back, and you have all the tables here. Now you need to do is like, you need to expand this table. Click on this icon, and it will give you an option to expand the table. You have to turn all the columns, so you keep the default option, which is select all columns, and click on OK. So it will expand all the columns, and you will get a nice little result set, which will have each customer number being grouped based on the descending order of date, and the first date will always have the number 1. So now just you need to add one filter here to filter on number 1 for the index column, and now if you see that, you will get the latest entry corresponding to each customer. See, customer 2, you will get the latest entry, and similarly customer 4, you will get the latest entry, customer 1, like that every customer you will get the latest entry. So this is how you create the subtable, and using that you generate the index column inside each of those tables, and then you expand the table and apply the required filter. So now if you apply this, you can see that in your model you will have only the latest entry for each of those customers. Go to the data view, check your table, and you can see that it will only contain the latest entry. So if you go to the advanced editor, you can see the entire steps now what you have done. So if you go to edit query, go to advanced editor, you can see the entire steps what we have done. So here we first grouped it, then we added that additional column, custom column, which will be based on the index on the table, and the table will be beforehand sorted on the basis of modified date descending, and we will name the column as entry ID. Once we have this column here, then we will expand it, and then finally we will apply the filter based on entry ID equal to 1 so as to get the latest table. So this is the easiest way in which you can get the latest entry for each of those customer groups. Now let's look at how we can implement similar logic inside players to select only those players who have never been rejected. Now we are inside the player table. Now here, as you see, there are multiple entries for each player. We want to only select those players who have never been rejected. So if you see, for example, player 2 was rejected on 2011, so he should not be picked. Player 2 was again rejected. So like that, different players have been rejected in different years, so all of them should not be considered. You should only consider those players who were never rejected. Again, we need to create the subtable. So let's start by applying the group by. Now we need to select player name and apply the group by, and again we need to select all rows, and you can here you can name it like player entries. So as before, we will get a subtable against each of those players, just like what we did in the last case. So for each of these subtables, now we are going to apply the logic which will check for the occurrence of any rejected entries. So for that purpose, let's go to add column, click on custom column, and then we can apply a function like Table.ContainsAny. So this is basically checking for the occurrence of a row with a corresponding condition, and if that exists, it will return a boolean result as true, otherwise it will return false. So here we need to pass the table, which is player entries, which will be the subtable corresponding to each of the player name, and then we need to pass as a list the condition, which is the column name is result equal to the value is rejected. So this will check for the occurrence of any row within the table where the result equal to rejected. And let's click on OK. So if you see, only player 4 will return false, all the others will return true, which means that for all the other players they have been rejected at least once. So for an example, if you click on the table near player 6, you can see there are rejected entries. Similarly, if you check on player 5, you can see again a rejected entry. If you check on player 4, you will not be able to see any of the rejected entries. So that's the only player which has never been rejected. So now what you need to do is like you can simply add a filter on this, which will only filter for false condition, which means that those players have never been rejected. And if you want to see the additional columns, you can now expand this table and click on OK, so that you can see that only player 4 out of all the players have never been rejected in the past. So this gives you the data that you are looking at. Again, come here and close and apply, and you can see that in your model you get only those players who has never been rejected in the past. So go to the model and check for the player selection. You can see only player who has never been rejected. So these are two common scenarios which we found here, which we could implement by means of creating a subtable and then applying the required type of logic inside, like adding an index column, sorting, checking for a condition, etc. So this is approach you can use within your Power Query whenever you want to apply such aggregated filters when the data is coming from a source other than RDBMS, and whenever there is a difficulty to implement such filters in your source, you can always use this kind of an approach inside your Power Query so as to apply aggregated filters to get your data. Hope this quick video helped you to understand the concept of subtables inside Power Query and how the subtables can be effectively applied in cases where you need to implement some kind of an aggregated filter within your data. As usual, keep sending your comments and feedback. Feel free to follow my YouTube channel for getting useful tips like this, and click on the bell icon to get notifications. Meet you all soon with another useful quick tip. Till then, bye and thanks for your time.